So it's the start of the new year. I hope you guys had a great 2022. We're going to start the year off with a video on baking powder versus baking soda. The goal of this video is to demystify what these things are and how they work, and how they're similar but not the same. So let's get started. So we're going to start off with baking soda. Number one, baking soda is what's called a leavening agent. It's something that makes bubbles to lighten up a mixture, to give some lift to the baked good that we're messing around with. In this case, baking soda is what's called a base. I'm not going to get into bases versus acids, but for simplicity, for baking, when you add a base and an acid, it makes gas. In this case, carbon dioxide gas, which adds that lift and gives those bubbles to a baked good. Now with a base, you need an acid. In this case, baking soda doesn't have an acid, it just has a base, because it is a base. So when we bake something, we need an acid. In our example, we got baking soda and buttermilk. This is why you use buttermilk, lemon juice, cocoa powder, brown sugar, yogurt, honey, etc. in recipes, because you need an acid to react with the baking soda to give it the texture that you need and to add the lift. And baking soda is 3 times stronger than baking powder, which is why you usually only need a little bit of it, and which is also why you can't really sub them one for one, or it's challenging. Because if you have baking soda, you usually have less baking soda than baking powder. If you sub baking soda 1-to-1 for baking powder, your recipe is going to taste terrible, because baking soda has this bitter, nasty taste as a base. So you gotta make sure the proportions are right, which is why you can't just sub them. Next up, baking powder. Baking powder, again, is a leavening agent. It adds those bubbles to lighten up a mixture, so it makes gas. The thing about baking powder, though, is that it's a combination of baking soda and an acid. So it's already got both ingredients we need to make the gas, and those are present in the powder form. Now, the thing to make baking powder work is moisture and heat. Most baking powder, what's called double acting. Double acting means that it lifts the cake or baked good twice. Once, when you add liquid to it, when you add those dry ingredients to wet ingredients and mix them up. 2, when you add heat to it. When you add heat to it, it gives it an extra lift. And baking powder is usually used in recipes that don't require much acid. Not all the time, but some of the time. From now on out into the summary, I'm going to give you guys some recipes to show you how this works in real time. So first, chocolate chip cookies. Chocolate chip cookies have, well, in this recipe, brown sugar and baking soda. I mentioned that brown sugar is an acid. It's really slightly acidic. But we need that acid to react with the baking soda, which is the base, to give the cookies some time and the ability to spread out and brown. This is why when you bake cookies, they spread out and brown, because of the chemistry that's going on. Now, we don't need the cookies to blow up, we just need a little bit of help to give them that texture that we want. And this is why we have these ingredients in the recipe. Next up is red velvet cake. Red velvet cake has a lot going on, but here we have our baking soda, cocoa powder, vinegar, and buttermilk. Those 3 are all acids, so you got plenty of acid to go around. In this case, the cake is not very airy, it's usually more dense, but we still need that baking soda to give it some little lift so that it gives us a texture that we want, so the cake's not flat. Again, there's chemistry going on. There's a reason why there's an acid and a base, because you need the lift to give the cake the qualities that we want. Next up is blueberry muffins, or muffins in general. Here we're talking about baking powder. When you look at the recipe, there is no acid. Well, the blueberries are acidic, but we don't count that. We're gonna mix the dry ingredients with the wet ingredients. And I mentioned before, this double act. So the first lift is gonna be with mixing wet and dry. The second is when we bake it. If you've ever made muffins, the mixture is very liquid, it's very loose. So we pour it in the muffin tin, we leave some room for it to lift up, and it lifts up because of this baking powder, because of the chemistry going on. The muffins go from liquid to nice and delicious. That's because of those 2 leavening processes that are going on. Lastly, chocolate cake. This is a recipe that I wanted to bring in to show you guys how both of these things can work together. So in this case, we have baking powder, baking soda, and cocoa. So we have the baking soda here that's going to react with the cocoa to give the cake some lift. But in this recipe, we want some extra lift. We don't want to add more acid. So what do we add? We add baking powder. And we add that to give it some extra lift, so we don't have to include other stuff. Because remember, baking powder has a base and an acid already in it. And that flavor, that nasty baking soda flavor, is going to be neutralized because of the baking powder. So in this case, we need both, and it's going to give a little extra help to that cake to give it the texture that we want. So in summary, we talked about baking soda. It's a base. Bases and acids react to create gas, which is why you need an acid in a recipe with baking soda in it, because you need that lift. So we spoke about buttermilk, brown sugar, yogurt, lemon juice, etc., etc. And it's much stronger than baking powder, which is why you can't really sub it one for one, because your recipe is going to taste disgusting. Then we have baking powder. Baking powder is a leavening agent just like baking soda. It makes those bubbles. But in this case, baking powder has the baking soda, which is a base, and an acid in it already in a powder form. It's going to make the gas, but it makes the gas by way of moisture and heat, that double acting power of the baking powder. And this is used in recipes that don't usually require an acid. Again, not all the time, but most of the time. Then we had chocolate chip cookies. The brown sugar and the baking soda react together to help the cookies spread out and brown. This is why we need the baking soda. Then we had red velvet cake, plenty of acid going around, vinegar, buttermilk, cocoa powder. We need some baking soda again to give it some lift. Even though it's a more dense cake, we need a little lift to get that texture that we want, so it's not flat. Then we have blueberry muffins, an example of baking powder. We add the baking powder to the dry ingredients and we mix them with the liquid to get that first leavening. Then we bake them to get that second leavening, which is why blueberry muffins, or muffins in general, go from really liquid to nice and puffy and delicious. Then we have chocolate cake. Chocolate cake uses both. We mentioned that we have baking soda and cocoa to give it the lift that we need, but we don't want to add extra acid, but we still want some extra lift. So we add baking powder, because in this recipe and many other recipes that use both, you want some extra help without adding more ingredients that you don't want. So that's all I got. Thank you for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.